Welcome back. Now, the annual rate of inflation has hit a 30-year high today. Rising fuel costs, strains on supply chains and, of course, the war in Ukraine will see prices rise almost across the board. But what else does a 7% inflation rate mean for people? That's what it's hit. We've been collecting your questions about the cost of living crisis throughout the day. And now, we hope, to answer as many of them as we can. To do that, I'm joined by an expert panel. Katherine Chapman, Director of the Living Wage Foundation, Paul Johnson, the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and Emma Revell from the British Retail Consortium. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us. Brains Trust, we're going to put the old grey matter to the test tonight. We've got questions starting off on the energy crisis first. Three of them, the first three are pretty much related, so we're going to deal with the first one and then I'll put the other two to other members of the panel. And this first question then comes from Tony, who asks, will gas and electricity prices ever return to their 2021 levels, or are we stuck with ever increasing bills? Paul Johnson, well, would you like to have a guess at this? Because it is really a guess, isn't it?
I think guess is the best way of putting it. I think the first thing to remember is that nobody was predicting this a year ago. So goodness knows what's going to happen in the future. There's a lot of things in that question. I don't think we're going to get ever increasing bills or ever increasing inflation. So even if the energy bills stay the same, at least they won't be getting worse. I think what's most likely to happen is that they'll come off the boil, as it were, go down to levels below where they will be this year, but for at least a period be well above where they were a year or two ago. However, we're looking into the slightly more distant future. It obviously becomes much more difficult to predict. New gas and so on is likely to come on stream, but probably more importantly for UK households, the amount of energy that we're getting from renewables is going up and up over time, and that will make us more insulated from what's happening in the world gas markets. But for now, I'm not expecting energy prices to go back down to pre-crisis levels for at least 2 or 3 years. OK, 2 or 3 years. Well, Katherine, I'd like to get your views on that. But let me put this next question to you, because it's almost directly related to this. This is from another viewer saying, at what point do you see the energy cap will decrease to an affordable level? So, right, the energy cap, we know it's gone up this month. It's going to go up presumably again in October. When do you see it decreasing? In other words, when do we see these energy costs going down?
Well, I mean, I think it's related to Paul Johnson's previous answer that this is incredibly complex. We can't predict the future. I think where we see it really hitting hard, though, is, as you said, what we do know is that these energy prices are going to continue increasing and being extremely unaffordable for particularly families on low incomes for at least the next 2 years or so. And what this really means in reality, and what we're starting to see through the work that we do, focused on those earning below the real living wage, or the wage that's needed for a decent standard of living, is families having to make real decisions about whether to put the heating on, whether to put food on the table. That's the kind of stark reality that many families on low incomes are living with at the moment. And unfortunately, that is going to get worse in the kind of short to medium term. We just hope that it will come down as soon as possible beyond that.
Yeah, it's going to get worse before it gets better. That's certainly the consensus so far. Emma Revell, let me ask you about energy prices, but let's follow through the supply chain and let's get up to the retail end of it. And this question from Wendy says, when do you think fuel prices will start to drop on the forecourt? Are we seeing the new normal? Because, of course, we had that 5p duty cut in the spring statement, but that's more or less been gobbled up by the rising prices already.
Well, it's difficult to say if and when prices will come down. Obviously, prices were increasing prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the subsequent sanctions put additional pressure on the cost of fuel. Retailers understand cost pressures facing motorists and are doing everything they can to offer the best value for money when it comes to petrol on the forecourt. And as you mentioned, the fuel duty cut that Rishi Sunak passed that Rishi Sunak gave back in March was passed on via retailers, within hours of that announcement being made. It is highly competitive, so supermarkets and other retailers would do everything they can to ensure that the price of fuel remains as low as possible.
OK, let's put our next question then. We're broadening it out now, and this is from Ashley, who says, will businesses and companies be expected to give staff and employees a rise to match the increase in inflation? Katherine, would you like to, have a go at that one? Are we going to see, and it's called, isn't it, back in proper inflationary times when inflation got into double digits, it's a wage price spiral?
I think what we're certainly starting to see at the Living Wage Foundation is we actually are seeing employers putting wages up. We've seen record numbers of employers signing up with the Living Wage Foundation. So we've now got over 10,000 employers that are committing to pay the higher voluntary living wage rates that are based on what it costs to live. And we've seen record numbers signing up in the past year and even latterly the past few months. So we definitely are seeing employers responding in that way and pushing wages up, because we are also, there are high vacancy rates at the moment. There are kind of business reasons to be doing this as well, to attract and retain staff. There is pressure on wages from that point of view. So we are starting to see that, certainly at the Living Wage Foundation, employers stepping up and increasing wages.
Paul Johnson, can you give us the economist's view on that? We are seeing wages now lagging, of course, behind inflation. Do you see it in the future, those wage demands then going up to at least keep up with inflation?
Well, I'm sure the demands will be there. I mean, I think there's several groups we need to think about here. The national living wage, the minimum wage, is going up by 6.6% this month, which looked really quite generous when it was announced back in the autumn, but is turning out to be actually below the rate of inflation. Probably most other people's wages will go up even less quickly than that, so further behind inflation. Of course, we don't know what's going to happen, but it would be surprising if they went up more quickly than that. And there's a particular issue in the public sector. The Chancellor didn't offer any more money to public services, to education, teaching, hospitals, nurses, and so on in his recent spring statement. And yet he made his proposals for spending, again, when he thought inflation was going to be a lot lower. So there isn't the kind of money in there to increase the wages of teachers and nurses and so on by anything like the rate of inflation. And don't forget, these are groups who, over the last decade or more, have actually seen pay cuts. The rest of us haven't seen much at all in the way of pay increases. It's been a terrible decade and a bit. But for teachers and others in the public sector, they've actually seen their pay fall already. And they're looking like seeing some more big falls over the next year relative to prices. OK, well, let's talk about another source of pressure on family budgets. This one's from Kaz about mortgage rates. And again, just asking, with soaring inflation, will mortgage rates go up? Emma, do you have a view on that? Are we seeing that happening already?
I'm afraid that's probably a question for another guest. I'm not sure. I'm an expert on mortgage.
That's back to you then, Paul Johnson. I mean, is it likely then that, or are mortgage rates actually beginning to move already?
They're beginning to move, and they will move a bit more. But don't forget, from absolutely rock bottom levels, I mean, interest rates are still essentially the lowest they've ever been in the whole of history. And the Bank of England was founded in the 1600s, and interest rates are lower than they've ever been in all of the time that it's been around. So yes, I think we'll see some increases in interest rates, but they will still remain very low. And what really matters as well is how high they are relative to inflation. So their real level, the real level of interest rates, is very, very negative. So if you've got inflation at 7% and interest rates at 2%, you're essentially not just borrowing for free, you're borrowing for much better than free. And I think that's one of the things that's really continuing to drive up house prices, because in this world of higher inflation and very low interest rates, borrowing to buy a house is one of the best hedges you've got against what's going to happen to inflation going forward.
Yeah, bad luck for those that don't. This is more up your street, Emma. Our next question from James, and it's about inflation and how high could it go. I'd say, says James, it feels more like 10% inflation rather than 7%. Do you think hyperinflation is going to hit the UK in the next 2 years? I suppose it depends on your definition of hyperinflation, but I think James certainly means, is it going to get into double figures at least?
Yeah, I think it's unlikely to see hyperinflation as it's usually defined, but inflation certainly is going to continue. And that's because the range of factors that are contributing to higher prices, whether that's labour costs, energy costs, or transport costs, or global commodity prices, they are all going to continue to rise. Retailers are incredibly aware, especially when it comes to food, how price sensitive consumers can be and how much this is essential items for everybody. So retailers are doing their best to absorb as many of those costs as they can. And many retailers are expanding their value ranges so people can continue to access essential food. But prices, unfortunately, are going to continue to go up because the ability of retailers to absorb those costs is limited.
And Katherine, what does that then mean? Back to that question about wages. If it does get 10% or above, we're going to see some pretty hefty wage demands, aren't we?
Yeah, well, it just puts pressure on already tight budgets, particularly for those on low earners. And what we do know for those on low incomes is that they tend to spend more of their disposable income on the essentials, on food and on housing. So it will hit those who are already struggling the hardest, unfortunately. And that's sort of what we're starting to see and what we will probably continue to see as these inflation levels rise. So it's really kind of squeezing and hitting those who are already feeling the pinch.
Next question, I think last for this section. Nell wants to know, very straightforward question. It's back to you, Paul, because we've been talking about house prices. Will house prices crash? I mean, you see it as a hedge against inflation. Is the demand always going to be there? Are they going to, house prices continue to go up?
I hate making predictions about this. I get it wrong continually. I mean, house prices have been going up at their fastest rate for a very long time over the last year, which, don't forget, has come as a real surprise again to people because, remember COVID? It looked like we were all going to get poorer after that. Lots of people out of work, lots of people furloughed and so on. But the labour market's incredibly strong. Lots of people saved quite a lot of money. Interest rates are still extremely low. So in retrospect, it's not surprising to me that house prices are rising so fast. And I don't think house prices are likely to crash because I think we're going to continue to be in a world in which interest rates are relatively low and inflation probably fairly high for a while. So my guess is no, we're not going to see a house price crash. But
okay.
Don't hold me to that.
We'll hold you to that, definitely, Paul. We'll have you back when hopefully it doesn't happen. We're going to take a break now. You're watching Sky News Tonight and a special question and answer session on the cost of living crisis coming up next. Questions about people's personal pensions.
Gina had a sort of tingling in her bones that she was potentially having twins because she was getting a lot of early side effects from the pregnancy. So within the first 5 seconds of the scan, the lady said, "Oh, you've got twins, congratulations." We're like, "Oh gosh, that's going to be a lot of hard work, but we can cope with that." And then 10 minutes in, that cliche where you hear people say, "I've looked at you like you've got 3 heads." Well, I did that on the scan. I saw 3 heads and asked the scanner, "Is that right? Or is that just someone's bottom?" And she was like, "No, in 25 years of scanning, that's the first time I've seen triplets." And then the scanner turned into the counsellor because it just went deathly silent. Yeah. And we were thinking, how on earth does this work exactly?
Yeah, I just screamed out triplets. So if anyone was walking past that room, they would have double taken, definitely. We're on the higher end of it being a little bit more unique because they also, yes, they're identical and they shared a placenta too. So that also made it very high risk of the pregnancy as well. So it was quite a roller coaster, literally from that day of finding out until now. So yeah, we haven't got off the roller coaster, have we?
This one I've got is Jensen. Gina has got Jimmy. And this little cheeky chappy holding the avocado is Jackson.
Yeah, he's got that right. He got it wrong yesterday. May I just throw that one in there? DNA-wise, they're identical, but they're being brought up in the same environment. We're giving them the same care, same love, same nurturing, but their personalities are completely different. And I know people say who are identical twins, they're different people, but when you actually see it for yourself, they are completely different. It's really, really interesting to watch.
Well, welcome back to our special Q&A. That's a question and answer session to you and me on the cost of living crisis. I'm joined by an expert panel, Katherine Chapman, Director of the Living Wage Foundation, Paul Johnson from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and Emma Revell from the British Retail Consortium. Thanks once again for being with us. Let's crack on. We've got a question here from Nick, who wants to know, how will a high rate of inflation affect my personal pension? Nick says he's due to start accessing my pension next year. What do you think, Katherine Chapman? I mean, inflation clearly is going to erode a pension, but I suppose it depends what kind of pension it is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not a pension expert, so other people can probably comment with much more insight than I. But yeah, as you say, it depends on what kind of pension you've got. He's obviously nearing the end, so it will impact more in terms of eroding the value of it. I'm not sure I've got a huge amount more insight to give into what, over the long term inflation means for pensions, other than a very general point, which is obviously the kind of squeeze it's going to put on people, the cost of living crisis is going to put on people over the next few years. Might mean that perhaps we do know that there is a looming kind of pensions problem looking decades ahead amongst particularly those on low incomes and not, adequacy of saving levels. So I suppose the current cost of living crisis is going to be counter to encouraging people to save, which could be just further storing up problems for the future. But yeah, other panelists might be able to provide more insight, I'm afraid, on that.
Well, we're going to move on in a minute, but as I said, it depends what kind of pension you have. If you're lucky enough to have one of the pretty rare nowadays index-linked pensions, then you're probably okay, but most people don't have those anymore. And if you're on the so-called money purchase pension, you could be in some trouble, and therefore you've got to look at the amount of money you take out of your pension pot. You might have to reduce that. Let's move on to Lee's question. He has this thought, and he says, does the Bank of England have another tool to combat inflation other than interest rates? Paul Johnson, because, I mean, that's first and foremost, isn't it, what an independent Bank of England's meant to do, is to police inflation and aim to get it to around 2% through the one club policy of interest rates. Does it have any other clubs, to continue with my golf analogy, does it have anything else it can do to deal with inflation?
Well, the Bank of England doesn't have a lot. I mean, it has, over the last many years, bought huge amounts of government debt, so-called quantitative easing. So one thing it can do is to reverse some of that, sell some of that back into the markets as a way of taking money out of the economy. Now, trouble is, it's never done that before. So how effective that would be in terms of reducing inflation is very hard to know. Broadly speaking, in any case, it said it wants to get interest rates up to a particular level, 1 or 2%, before it does that in any case. So the bank itself has very limited tools and has been remarkably reluctant to use those tools over the last several months in any serious way, partly, I think, because it sees the inflation being created to a large extent, at least, outside of the UK. I mean, we are not responsible for the higher fuel prices, the higher wheat prices, the higher semiconductor prices and so on that are driving inflation. But at some point, I think they're going to have to do a bit more, because in the end, the interest rates are really the only serious tool they've got. And actually, the government itself can't do a lot about inflation itself. Again, it can't really control the prices of these things coming into the economy unless it's going to take a remarkable amount of control of the economy, which even in the 1970s we didn't see.
And Emma, there's a dimension in that question for you. I'm interested in the retail view on this, because Lee says the Bank of England seem to think that consumer spending is driving inflation. Are we seeing that in the shops? And, once people access their savings and burn through them, will it all slow down?
I think as people have less disposable income, obviously that will impact what they spend on non-essentials. But I think Paul is exactly right. The Bank of England and the government have very few levers that they can pull because of the diverse range of factors, many of which are indeed global, that are feeding into inflation, whether that's higher energy costs, transport costs, labour costs, or global commodity prices. There's very little the Bank of England can do about most of those things.
OK, well, thank you all very much indeed. Out of time, Emma Revell, Paul Johnson, Katherine Chapman. Very good talking to you. Thank you very much indeed. Got time for a very quick look at the weather, I think.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
So it's getting warmer and warmer, but some rain or showers around at times this evening. It's mostly fine, but northeast Scotland will stay rather dull and damp. Mist and low cloud will affect some northern and southwestern coasts. It'll be mainly dry overnight.